The bank teller's face went white as she stared at her computer screen. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to get my manager," she whispered, her voice trembling. "There's something very wrong with this account." I felt my stomach drop as I watched her practically sprint toward the back office, leaving me standing there with Grandma Rose's trembling hand in mine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Elena, and I should have seen the signs sooner. Maybe if I hadn't been so buried in my nursing school finals, or if I hadn't been working double shifts at the diner to pay rent, I would have noticed what my cousins were doing to Grandma Rose. But hindsight is a cruel teacher, and by the time I realized something was terribly wrong, they had already done months of damage. I was the oddball in our family, the granddaughter who took community college classes and served coffee for tips, while my cousins Bradley and Tessa drove BMWs and lived in their pristine suburban homes. They were the golden children, both married to successful spouses, both with corner offices and investment portfolios. Bradley worked in real estate development, and Tessa had married into a law firm. They belonged to country clubs and took Caribbean vacations, while I clipped coupons and rode the bus. The family dynamic had always been clear. They were the successes, I was the charity case. When we gathered for holidays at Grandma Rose's modest ranch house in Millbrook, they would ask about my little job and my cute classes with the kind of patronizing smile that my teeth hurt. They never asked if I needed help with tuition or rent, but they sure loved reminding everyone how generous they were when they occasionally picked up the check at dinner. Grandma Rose was different with me. While my cousins saw their visits as obligations, rushing through perfunctory conversations before checking their phones, I actually enjoyed spending time with her. She would tell me stories about her youth when she worked as a seamstress and saved every penny to buy the little house where she'd lived for 40 years. She was sharp as a tack, could beat anyone at crossword puzzles, and had an opinion about everything from politics to the proper way to fold fitted sheets. That's why the phone call last October was so jarring. I was studying for my pharmacology exam when Grandma Rose called, sounding confused and frightened. "Elena, sweetheart, I think someone took money from my purse. I had $200 yesterday, and now there's only $40. Her voice was shaky in a way I'd never heard before. I drove over immediately, finding her sitting at her kitchen table with her purse contents spread out before her, counting and recounting the same bills. "Maybe you paid a bill and forgot," I suggested gently. But even as I said it, something felt off. Grandma Rose had always been meticulous with money, the kind of person who balanced her checkbook to the penny every month. Over the next few weeks, the calls became more frequent and more troubling. She couldn't remember conversations we'd had the day before. She would call me 3 times in an afternoon asking the same question. Most concerning, she kept mentioning money problems, saying her bank account didn't look right. But when I offered to help her check, she would get defensive and change the subject. That's when my cousins suddenly became very attentive grandchildren. Bradley started visiting twice a week, always volunteering to help with paperwork and finances. Tessa began taking Grandma Rose to doctor appointments and the bank, insisting she was just being helpful. They praised each other constantly at family dinners for being so responsible, so caring, so dedicated to making sure Grandma Rose was taken care of. I should have been grateful for their newfound involvement, but something nagged at me. Grandma Rose seemed more confused after their visits, not less. She would mention Bradley helping her with important documents, but couldn't remember what they were. When I asked about her finances, she would look vaguely worried and say Bradley was handling everything now, that it was all too complicated for her to understand. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in February. I had stopped by with groceries and found Grandma Rose crying at the kitchen table, holding a bank statement with shaking hands. "I don't understand this," she sobbed. "The numbers don't make sense. Where did all my money go?" I sat down beside her and gently took the statement. What I saw made my blood run cold.
Her savings account, which had contained over $60,000 just 6 months earlier, now showed a balance of $837. The checking account was in worse shape, overdrawn by $200 with insufficient funds fees piling up daily. But the transaction history made me feel sick. Withdrawal after withdrawal, often for thousands of dollars at a time. Cash advances, transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, electronic payments to luxury retailers and high-end restaurants. The pattern was clear and damning. Someone had been systematically draining Grandma Rose's life savings while her dementia progressed. "Grandma, do you remember making these withdrawals?" I asked as gently as I could, pointing to a $5,000 cash withdrawal from the previous week. She stared at the paper with the blank, frightened look that had become increasingly common. "Bradley took me to the bank. He said there were papers to sign, but I don't remember. I can't remember what they were for." My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone and took pictures of every page of the statement. The evidence was right there in black and white, but I knew my cousins would deny everything. They would say Grandma Rose agreed to the withdrawals, that they were helping her manage her money, that her dementia made her forget what she had authorized. That afternoon, I called Bradley directly. "We need to talk about Grandma Rose's finances," I said without preamble. There was a pause before he responded, his voice smooth and condescending. "Elena, I appreciate your concern, but Grandma asked me to handle her financial affairs. It's quite complex. Probably not something you'd understand given your background." Her background? The dismissal stung, but I pressed on. "Bradley, her savings account is nearly empty. There are thousands of dollars in unexplained withdrawals." "Everything has been properly documented and authorized," he said coolly. "Grandma Rose has been having memory issues, as I'm sure you've noticed. She needed someone responsible to help manage her expenses. The family agreed I was the best choice." "What family? Nobody asked me." He laughed, the sound sharp and unpleasant. "Elena, you're sweet, but you're hardly in a position to provide financial guidance. You work at a diner and live in a studio apartment. Leave these matters to people who actually understand money." The line went dead, leaving me staring at my phone in stunned silence. The message was clear. Stay out of it, mind your own business, know your place in the family hierarchy. But as I looked at Grandma Rose's bank statement spread across my tiny kitchen table, I knew I couldn't let this go. My cousins had always treated me like an outsider, the poor relation who didn't quite belong. Now they were counting on that same dismissal to keep me quiet while they robbed a vulnerable old woman blind. They had no idea that the granddaughter they had spent years underestimating was about to become their worst nightmare. The next morning, I helped Grandma Rose get dressed and drove her to Millbrook Community Bank, the small neighborhood branch where she'd banked for over 30 years. That's where we met Mrs. Patterson, the teller who would change everything, and learned just how deep this betrayal ran. Mrs. Patterson had worked at Millbrook Community Bank for 15 years, and she knew every regular customer by name. When she saw Grandma Rose approaching her window that Wednesday morning, her usual warm smile flickered with something that looked like concern. "Mrs. Castellano, how lovely to see you," she said, but her eyes darted to me with a question.
"And this must be your granddaughter, Elena. Your grandson Bradley mentioned you might be coming in." The fact that Bradley had somehow anticipated our visit sent a chill through me, but I kept my voice steady. "Yes, we'd like to review Grandma Rose's account activity. She's been having some concerns about her statements." Mrs. Patterson's fingers hesitated over her keyboard. "Of course. Let me pull up your accounts, Mrs. Castellano." As the screen loaded, I watched her face change. The polite banker's mask slipped, replaced by something between shock and alarm. "Ma'am, I'm going to need to get my manager," she whispered, and that's when I knew we had stumbled onto something much bigger than I had imagined. Branch manager David Chen appeared within minutes, a slight man in his 50s with wire-rimmed glasses and the kind of careful demeanor that suggested he'd seen every financial nightmare imaginable. He ushered us into his private office, closing the door with unusual urgency. "Mrs. Castellano," he began gently, "I want you to know that we've been monitoring some unusual activity on your accounts. We actually have several suspicious activity reports filed with federal banking authorities." Grandma Rose looked confused, her hands fidgeting with her purse strap. "I don't understand. What does that mean?" Mr. Chen pulled out a thick folder and opened it carefully. "Over the past 6 months, there have been numerous large cash withdrawals from your accounts, often just under the $10,000 reporting threshold. The pattern suggests someone with knowledge of banking regulations. Additionally, we've documented several instances where you appeared confused or distressed during transactions." He turned to me. "Are you familiar with these withdrawals?" I shook my head, my heart pounding. "That's why we're here. My grandmother's life savings have been almost completely drained, and she can't remember authorizing most of these transactions." Mr. Chen nodded grimly. "What's particularly concerning is that these withdrawals always occur when Mrs. Castellano is accompanied by the same 2 individuals, a man and a woman who have presented themselves as her grandchildren, helping her with her finances." "Bradley and Tessa," I said, the names bitter in my mouth. "The bank has a duty to report suspicious activity, but we can't freeze accounts without clear evidence of fraud or a court order. However, I can tell you that the withdrawal patterns, the amounts, and the circumstances have all raised red flags in our system." Grandma Rose began crying quietly. The weight of the situation finally penetrated her confusion. "I trusted them. They said they were helping me. They said I was too confused to handle my own money." Mr. Chen leaned forward compassionately. "Mrs. Castellano, I want you to know that we've been monitoring some unusual activity on your accounts. We actually have several suspicious activity reports filed with federal banking authorities. Financial elder abuse is unfortunately common, and it often involves family members who exploit their relatives' cognitive decline." He handed me a business card. "I'm referring you to Adult Protective Services, and I strongly recommend you contact an attorney who specializes in elder law. In the meantime, I can help you change account passwords and require additional verification for any future transactions." As we left the bank that day, I felt like I was carrying a weight that might crush me. I had suspected my cousins of taking advantage of Grandma Rose, but hearing it confirmed by a banking professional made it terrifyingly real. They weren't just being opportunistic. They were systematically stealing from a vulnerable woman using sophisticated methods designed to avoid detection. That evening, I called my Aunt Margaret, Bradley's mother. Surely she would want to know what her son was doing to his own grandmother. "Elena, honey, I think you might be misunderstanding the situation," she said after I explained what we'd discovered at the bank. "Bradley told me Rose asked him to help her manage her finances because her memory has been so poor. Maybe she just forgot giving him permission." "Aunt Margaret, we're talking about nearly $60,000. The bank has filed federal reports because the activity looks suspicious." There was a long pause. "Well, I'm sure there's an explanation. Bradley is very responsible with money. Maybe Rose had some expenses you don't know about. Medical bills can be quite high at her age." The conversation continued in circles, with Aunt Margaret making excuses and suggesting I was overreacting. When I finally hung up, I realized that the family had already been prepared for my accusations. Bradley had been laying groundwork, painting me as the unstable cousin who couldn't be trusted, while positioning himself as the responsible caretaker. My next call was to my Uncle Frank, Tessa's father. The conversation was even worse. "Elena, I appreciate your concern, but I think you need to be very careful about making accusations," he said, his voice cold. "Tessa has been incredibly devoted to Rose, taking time off work to drive her to appointments, helping with household management. If you start spreading rumors about financial impropriety, you could be looking at defamation issues." The threat was clear, and it terrified me.
Here I was, a nursing student with no money for lawyers, going up against family members who had both legal connections and the resources to destroy me. But every time I looked at Grandma Rose, increasingly frail and confused, I knew I couldn't back down. The next few weeks were a nightmare of gaslighting and manipulation. Bradley and Tessa began showing up at Grandma Rose's house more frequently, always when I wasn't around. They would stay for hours, emerging with signed papers and cheerful reports about how well they were managing her affairs. When I tried to discuss the financial situation with Grandma Rose, she would become agitated and defensive. Bradley explained everything to me. He's taking care of it. You're making me confused with all these questions. I realized they were using her own cognitive decline against her, presenting themselves as the stable, reliable family members while portraying me as the one causing problems. Every time I raised concerns, I looked like the troublemaker disrupting the family harmony they had carefully constructed. The breaking point came when I arrived at Grandma Rose's house one Saturday afternoon to find a for sale sign in the front yard. I ran inside, my key still working, thankfully, to find her sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of real estate documents. "Grandma, what is this?" I asked, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. She looked up at me with the vacant expression that had become heartbreakingly familiar. "Bradley says the house is too much for me to manage. He found a nice assisted living place. Very expensive, but he says my savings will cover it." I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. They weren't just stealing her money. They were selling her house too, probably planning to pocket the proceeds while warehousing her in some facility where she couldn't interfere with their plans.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
I don't know anymore. Everything is so confusing. Bradley says it's for the best, but this is my home. I've lived here for 40 years. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about Mr. Chen's words about needing a court order to stop the financial abuse. But how could I afford legal fees on a diner waitress's salary? How could I prove elder abuse when my cousins had covered their tracks so carefully? By morning, I had made my decision. I was going to fight this, even if it meant taking on my entire extended family. Grandma Rose had been the only person in my family who believed in me, who saw potential in the granddaughter everyone else dismissed. Now it was my turn to protect her, even if it cost me everything. I called in sick to work and spent the day researching elder law attorneys, looking for someone who might take a case like ours. I printed copies of all the bank records and began building a timeline of the financial abuse. If my cousins wanted a war, they were about to discover that the family member they'd spent years underestimating had more fight in her than they'd ever imagined. The attorney's office smelled like leather and disappointment. Patrician Valdez was the fourth elder law lawyer I'd contacted, and like the others, she listened patiently to my story before explaining why she probably couldn't help me. The challenge with financial elder abuse cases involving family members is proving lack of consent, she said, her voice kind but realistic. Your cousins will claim your grandmother authorized every transaction. Without clear evidence of coercion or documentation of her mental state at the time of each withdrawal, it becomes very difficult to prosecute. I slumped in the chair across from her mahogany desk, feeling the weight of impossibility settling on my shoulders. So they just get away with it? Not necessarily, she said, leaning forward. But we'd need something concrete. Documentation of their admissions, recordings of coercive behavior, or financial records that clearly show a pattern of exploitation that couldn't have been authorized by someone with dementia. As I drove away from her office, something she said kept echoing in my mind. Documentation of their admissions. I thought about how confident Bradley and Tessa had become, how openly they discussed managing Grandma Rose's affairs in front of family members. They felt untouchable because they assumed no one would challenge them. That evening, I sat in my studio apartment staring at my phone. What if they weren't as careful as they thought? What if their arrogance was actually their weakness? I started with social media. Tessa's Instagram was a carefully curated showcase of luxury, designer handbags, expensive dinners, weekend trips to wine country.
But when I looked at the dates, a pattern emerged. The posts coincided perfectly with the large withdrawals from Grandma Rose's account. A $5,000 cash withdrawal on March 15th was followed the next day by photos of Tessa at a spa resort in Napa Valley. A $3,500 withdrawal in April matched with Bradley's posts about a golf weekend in Scottsdale. I screenshotted everything, building a timeline that showed their spending spikes directly correlating with Grandma Rose's financial losses. But I needed more. The next morning, I called Bradley's office, disguising my voice slightly. "Hi, this is Sarah from Millbrook Community Bank. Mr. Bradley Castellano asked me to call about scheduling his next appointment with Mrs. Rose Castellano for account management." The receptionist was helpful and unsuspecting. "Oh, yes, he's been bringing his grandmother in regularly. Let me check his calendar. Looks like he has her scheduled for this Friday at 2 o'clock. Should I confirm that appointment?" "Perfect, that works," I said, hanging up quickly. They had been so systematic about it that they actually scheduled Grandma Rose's exploitation like regular business appointments. Friday afternoon, I positioned myself in the coffee shop across from the bank with a clear view of the entrance. At exactly 2 o'clock, Bradley's silver Mercedes pulled up, and he helped Grandma Rose out of the passenger seat. Even from a distance, I could see how fragile she looked, how she leaned heavily on his arm. I waited 10 minutes before entering the bank, approaching Mrs. Patterson's window with my heart pounding. "I'd like to open a savings account, but I'm wondering if you could help me with something else first?" She glanced around nervously before leaning closer. "What do you need?" "My grandmother is in there right now with my cousin. I have reason to believe he's coercing her into making withdrawals. Is there any way you could document what happens?" Mrs. Patterson's eyes widened. "We can't film customers, but I can take detailed notes of the interaction, and if your grandmother appears distressed or confused, I can ask Mr. Chen to intervene." 20 minutes later, Bradley emerged from Mr. Chen's office with Grandma Rose and a withdrawal slip. As they approached Mrs. Patterson's window, I moved to the customer service desk where I could hear their conversation. "Now, Grandma, just like we discussed, you're taking out $8,000 to pay for your medical expenses, right?" Bradley's voice was loud and patronizing, clearly intended for the bank staff to hear. Grandma Rose looked confused and frightened. "I don't remember having medical expenses." "That's why I'm here to help you remember," Bradley said, tone patient but firm. "The Dr. Morrison said you need that special treatment in the member. We talked about this yesterday." "I don't think I talked to Dr. Morrison," she said, her voice small and uncertain. "The memory problems are getting worse," Bradley announced to Mrs. Patterson, as if Grandma Rose wasn't standing right there. "That's why the family asked me to handle her finances. She gets very confused about these things." I watched Mrs. Patterson's jaw tighten as she processed the transaction, making careful notes on a piece of paper. When they left, she immediately called Mr. Chen. That afternoon, I received a call that changed everything. It was Detective Maria Santos from Millbrook Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit. "Ms. Castellano, we've received a referral from Millbrook Community Bank regarding potential financial elder abuse involving your grandmother."
Chen mentioned you might have additional information and spent 2 hours at the police station turning over every piece of evidence I'd collected. The social media posts, the bank records, the timeline of withdrawals and luxury purchases, the real estate listing for Grandma Rose's house. Detective Santos listened carefully, taking detailed notes. "What you've documented here suggests a clear pattern of financial exploitation," she said. "The bank's suspicious activity reports, combined with your evidence, gives us grounds to investigate. But I need to warn you, these cases can tear families apart." "My family was already torn apart," I told her. "They did that when they decided to steal from a vulnerable old woman." The investigation moved quickly once it started. Detective Santos obtained warrants for Bradley and Tessa's financial records, revealing that they had used Grandma Rose's money to pay off credit card debt, make luxury purchases, and even invest in Bradley's real estate ventures. The paper trail was devastating. But the moment that broke the case wide open came when Detective Santos interviewed Grandma Rose with a specialist trained in working with dementia patients. Using gentle questioning techniques, the specialist was able to establish that Grandma Rose had never authorized the large withdrawals and had repeatedly expressed confusion and distress about her missing money. The real breakthrough came when they searched Bradley's home computer. He had been meticulous about documenting his financial schemes,
keeping spreadsheets that tracked every dollar stolen from Grandma Rose's accounts. In his arrogance, he had created the very evidence that would convict him. The family meeting that followed was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Detective Santos had asked me to be present when she arrested Bradley and Tessa, wanting Grandma Rose to have a familiar face during the trauma. When Bradley saw me sitting in Grandma Rose's living room next to the detective, his confident mask finally slipped. "You called the police? Elena, what the hell do you think you're doing?" "I'm protecting my grandmother from thieves," I said calmly. Detective Santos stood up, badge visible. "Bradley Castellano and Tessa Morrison, you're both under arrest for financial elder abuse, theft, and conspiracy." The accusations flew then. They called me jealous, vindictive, unstable. They claimed I was trying to get revenge for being left out of the financial management. They insisted Grandma Rose had authorized everything, that her memory problems made her an unreliable witness. But Detective Santos had heard it all before. "We have your computer records, Mr. Castellano. Your own spreadsheets document every dollar you stole from Grandma Rose's accounts. Your own notes describe your grandmother's confusion and your plans to take advantage of it." The color drained from Bradley's face. He had been so proud of his methodical approach, so confident in his superior intelligence. He never imagined that his own careful documentation would become the evidence that destroyed him. Over the following months, the full scope of their theft was revealed. They had stolen over $78,000 from Grandma Rose's accounts. They had forged documents to put her house on the market. They had even convinced her to sign papers making them beneficiaries of her life insurance policy. But here's what they never counted on. The granddaughter they had dismissed as worthless, the family member they thought was too poor and powerless to matter, had been willing to fight for someone she loved when no one else would. The legal proceedings took almost a year. Both Bradley and Tessa were convicted of financial elder abuse and theft and conspiracy. They were ordered to pay full restitution plus damages. Their assets were frozen and liquidated to repay what they had stolen. The house sale was canceled, and Grandma Rose was able to stay in her home with the help of a caregiver paid for by the restitution funds. Her accounts were restored, and additional safeguards were put in place to prevent future exploitation. My extended family, faced with the undeniable evidence of Bradley and Tessa's crimes, had no choice but to acknowledge what had happened. Some apologized for not believing me. Others simply stopped speaking to me altogether, apparently more angry about the family scandal than the abuse that caused it. As for me, the nursing student who worked at a diner and lived in a studio apartment, I discovered something important about myself during that terrible year. When it mattered most, when someone I loved was being hurt, I had found the courage and determination to fight people with more money, more connections, and more power. Grandma Rose, now safe in her own home with her finances protected, still has good days and bad days. But on her good days, she remembers what I did for her, and she tells me something that makes all of it worthwhile. "Elena, my dear, you were the only one who saw me as a person worth protecting instead of a bank account worth emptying." The family members who once dismissed me as irrelevant learned that sometimes the person everyone underestimates is exactly the person you should fear the most, because when you have nothing to lose and someone to protect, there's no limit to what you'll do to make sure justice prevails. 3 years have passed since that day at Millbrook Community Bank, when Mrs. Patterson first whispered those life-changing words about suspicious activity. I graduated from nursing school with honors, and now I work at the same hospital where Dr. Morrison practices. He still doesn't know I'm the granddaughter who exposed Bradley's lies about expensive treatments that never existed. Grandma Rose lives comfortably in her house on Maple Street, the same home Bradley and Tessa tried to steal from under her nose. Her caregiver, Maria, has become like family to both of us. On good days, Grandma Rose tends her garden and bakes cookies that fill the house with the scent of vanilla and cinnamon. On difficult days, she may not remember my name, but she always smiles when she sees me, calling me her angel to anyone who will listen. The restitution money has been carefully managed by a court-appointed guardian, ensuring that Grandma Rose will never again be vulnerable to financial predators.
every month I review the statements with her guardian, remembering how close we came to losing everything. My relationship with the extended family remains complicated. Aunt Margaret eventually apologized, admitting she had suspected something was wrong, but chose to look the other way. Uncle Frank still maintains that I overreacted, though he speaks to me civilly at family gatherings now. The cousins who once mocked my secondhand clothes and community college dreams have learned a hard lesson about underestimating people. Bradley was released from prison last year and works at a car dealership in another state. Tessa served 18 months and now lives with her in-laws, her law firm career permanently destroyed. Neither has attempted to contact Grandma Rose or me, though I sometimes wonder if they understand the magnitude of what they lost when they chose greed over family. The real victory isn't in their punishment, though. It's in the knowledge that when someone I loved was being hurt, I found the strength to fight for her. The girl who once felt powerless and dismissed discovered she had a voice worth hearing and a will strong enough to take on anyone who threatened the people she cared about.